Hey everyone, and welcome to our next episode from Hike and Hearth. Today we are going to talk about ethical owl watching in North America, but really the rules apply regardless of where you might be located when you're doing your bird watching. If this is your first time watching one of our videos, hi, I'm Lynn, and
I'm Dustin. Welcome to Hike and Hearth.
awesome. So Dustin is our resident subject matter expert when it comes to topics of conservation, bird watching, and wildlife photography in general. And I'm his faithful sidekick of 21 years. Okay, owls. Dustin, owls are fascinating creatures. So many of us really love owls. And when I was thinking about us having this conversation today, the first question that kind of popped into my head was, why do we all love owls so much? Like, it seems like even people who aren't hardcore bird watchers love owls. What is it about them that's so unique?
Yeah, I think they have a lot of things that are going for them. Several factors, right? First is they're very unique. The bird taxonomy is really deep. There's dozens or hundreds of different genera of bird species, but most of them are similar to each other, right? With a few exceptions, right? Penguins are different than all the other birds. Ostriches are different than all the other birds, but we don't get to see those very much. Mm-hmm. Owls are also different than all the other birds. They're different in behavior. They're different in structure. And they're difficult to come by because they're rare, both in terms of the number of species that we have in kind of any given geography. But they're also hard to come by because most of them are nocturnal or diurnal, just hunting, at daybreak and at sundown. So you put those factors together and it always feels special to see an owl no matter how you came across it.
That's really interesting. I had never thought about it that way before, but it makes sense when you started to kind of spell it out for me a little bit.
Yeah, and it explains why owls hold a special place in like folklore and literature, because when someone sees an owl, it makes a striking impression immediately because they're often really silent. So you sort of see them and might be startled by them. And they have this aura, and that's why they've developed a reputation of being like the wise old owl and things like that.
Yeah. Oh, and I feel like this is such a miss right now because a good friend of ours just came back from a holiday trip over to Greece. And what she brought us back as a gift for dog sitting for her was Athena's owl,
We'll pop
a little
in as a picture
statue.
later.
Yeah, I should have had it out in our background because, yeah, to your folklore point, that's totally true. Okay, so let's talk about owl species. Do you know how many are there? You said they're kind of rare. There's not a ton of them. How many are there? Are they found throughout the world?
They are found throughout the world. I think there's approximately 200 species of owl around the globe. But I have no idea where the densest place for owls is. Like, I think in any given location, you might only have 5 or 10 species of owls kind of max. But within the owl species, they're also kind of broken into different sizes, right? There's large owls like the great horned owl we have locally, and small ones like the screech owl. That's true around the world, that there's owls of sort of different class sizes.
Okay. Now, we live in New England in Massachusetts. So do we have owls that are here year round, or do they migrate away from us?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
Here in New England, we primarily have resident owls, and we have a few migrants that migrate to here over the winter. Not too many that migrate away from here over the winter.
Okay. What are our resident owls that we see?
So kind of from largest to smallest, our resident owls are the great horned owl, which is sort of your quintessential owl maybe most people think of.
Yeah.
Then next smallest is a barred owl, then an eastern screech owl.
Oh, I have a soft spot in my heart for the eastern screech owl because when we bought this little fixer-upper lake cottage where we live outside of Boston, one of the first years that we were here. Do you remember that? It was like middle of the night, and all of a sudden we heard this loud sound coming from the trees on the other side of the street from us, and it sounded like a horse whinnying. And It was like a scene out of My Cousin Vinny. I like sat up in the middle of the night and was like, what the heck is that sound? And that's what it was.
Yeah, they're sort of like,
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I do have a soft spot in my heart for that little owl. Now, there's one owl that I know is one of our winter residents in this area that you did not mention. And that would be, do you know which one I'm hinting at?
Well, your words were interesting there. So is it a winter owl or is it a resident owl? Because to birders, resident means year round.
No, this is not a year-round owl. This is the one that shows up in the wintertime and you drag me to the shore and we hike around the dunes for hours in the middle of the winter.
Yeah, so that's a migrating owl. It comes from the Arctic. I assume you're talking about the snowy owl.
Yes.
Right, which is definitely the most sought after photographic and observable owl species, probably in North America, if not the world, because it's so striking. And of course, it's been highlighted prominently in popular culture lately.
Yes.
With the Harry Potter franchise and all that.
Yep. Yep.
So snowy owls are, that's an owl that, I don't know, I guess before I was into birding and even early into birding, I sort of thought, I'll probably never see a snowy owl, or man, wouldn't I be blessed, so to speak, to happen upon a snowy owl someday. But it turns out they come to Massachusetts kind of on the regular, not every year in the winter, not even necessarily every other year, but every year there's a chance that some snowy owls will come down from the Arctic and settle along the Massachusetts coast or on some large open tracts of land. And some years are better than others. So some years we have dozens or hundreds of them, and sometimes we might have one or two, and sometimes there's sort of none to be found. They're really enigmatic that way.
We're going to come back to this owl in particular a little bit later. And if you're a birder and you know what the topic of the vodcast is, you probably already can guess where we're going to go with that conversation. But before we get to that later on, are there any owls that do happen upon here every once in a while that are considered even rarer than the snowy owl? Is there anything in particular that's kind of a big deal if it arrives?
Yeah, let's talk about all the winter visitors for a minute. So in addition to snowy owls in the winter, we get a relatively large population of northern saw-whet owls, which are super cute little, they almost look like a Christmas tree ornament type owl. And they come every year on the regular. They're just super secretive. And the science used to suggest that northern saw-whet owls were like exceedingly rare and like super hard to find. The more modern science is that they're super hard to find, but they're not so rare. They're just difficult to spot because unlike other birds, if you get close to them, they don't flush and fly away. So you might walk right under a branch that has a northern saw-whet owl on it and not see it and never know that you had them. So there's certainly chances you might walk right by one and never notice because they're just so secretive and so well camouflaged. But in addition to them, we have some other winter migrants, notably the long-eared owl and the short-eared owl.
I've never heard of those species before.
Right, which they're both owls that will hunt over like an open field. So we can definitely see these in places like the North Shore of Massachusetts, places like Parker River Wildlife Area, and also even at Logan Airport, places like that.
Oh, wow.
Especially snowy owls. But so the snowy owls get a lot of attention, and there's relatively more in those years when they come in larger numbers, there's relatively more snowy owls. They get all the attention. The short-eared and long-eared owls kind of develop a more exclusive territory. And so there's not so many of them close to each other. So they're harder to come by. There's probably a lot fewer short-eared and long-eared owls than snowy owls. But they're probably here every year where snowy owls are not.
Interesting. All right. So I had
two others to mention on that topic, not to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Every once in a great while, we'll get a great gray owl, which is a really cool owl that's more like up in Canada and sort of like northern Minnesota and North Dakota, that kind of space. But every once in a while, some will come down into New England, particularly northern Maine, northern Vermont. And every once in a while, maybe one every 5 or 10 years, kind of a northern hawk owl. And that's an owl that's been seen a lot this year in northern Minnesota, kind of in the northeast part of Minnesota this year. For whatever reason, there's been a number of northern hawk owls, but a couple of years ago when I first got into birding, there was one of those in Vermont that drew a lot of birders. But those are a lot more rare than snowy owls.
Interesting. And we haven't seen any northern hawk owls that you're aware of this year?
No.
Okay. All right. So I had asked Dustin a question a couple days ago when we started talking about this episode. So one of the things that I know, being married to a birder, is that you have a bucket list of species of birds that you're hoping to see in your lifetime, if you're lucky enough to come across one. And what I had asked you the other day is, when it comes to bucket lists like that, are there owls that are like the most sought after in North America? Like, what would be like the top 3 owls many birders would have on their bucket lists?
Yeah, this is a good question because it really depends on what the individual person means by the top or the most sought after. So certainly I think in general, the great horned owl has a lot more birders that go looking for it, that find it, that have photographs. It's widespread all across North America. So in terms of sheer numbers, there's a lot more looking for and finding great horned owls.
Okay.
Right? So that's probably the top one. The snowy owl that we mentioned is a lot rarer and a lot more of a trophy to find. Mm-hmm. So people hunting for snowy owls are more intense, but there's huge parts of the country where you're never going to find a snowy owl, so you're not going to look. So on a sort of per capita basis, it's way less popular to search for, but it's much more prized for its rarity and its unique beauty, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And then lastly is the eastern screech owl, which again is widespread across North America, but they're much harder to find than great horned owls because they spend a lot of their time down in tree cavities in their holes and stuff. So those are one that most birders don't find on their own, but they're looking at every empty hole in every tree, hoping to find a screech owl that might be up, sticking its head out of the hole. And a lot of times there's a known tree cavity with them. And they're also unique because they come in 2 different color variations. There's a red version of the eastern screech owl and a gray version. It's sort of like yellow labs and black labs, but in the owl realm. And they even can mate and produce offspring of both colors in the same clutch. So it's pretty interesting. But the gray version's a lot more common than the red version. I think it's about 70-30, 70% gray, 30% red.
And they're adorable.
They are adorbs.
And they're a little, and they sound like ponies. So that's why I love them. What are the little ones that live in the ground?
Those are burrowing owls. Those are more kind of in the southeast. Florida has some.
They're
good
super
populations of
duper
burrowing
cute
owls.
too. I wouldn't mind seeing one of those someday. So before we go any further, because I do want to talk a little more about snowy owls, as I alluded to earlier, but I think we need a disclaimer here because you're using a word a few times, and I just want to make sure that our audience, there's some clarity here. You've used the word hunting twice now.
Okay.
What is your definition of hunting in this context of this discussion?
Good point. I actually don't recall which context I used it in. Did I mean like birders were hunting for owls or the owls were hunting for prey?
You were talking about birders hunting for owls. You said it twice.
Yeah. So, I mean, looking for owls, not hunting to shoot them or anything like that.
Right.
All of these owls are protected by the North American Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So hunting of all of these owls is off the table in North America. But, we can probably show a picture of a mottled owl that I saw in Costa Rica the last time that I was there. And in places like that, capturing birds is more part of like the regular culture, and it hasn't died out yet. So there's certainly places in the world where true hunting, might be the case. I'm not in touch with sort of the prevalence of hunting of owls elsewhere, but I certainly didn't mean it in that context here. I mean, looking for it to find an owl to shoot with a camera.
Right. And I knew exactly what he meant, but I just wanted to make that clear. I think terminology is important as someone who's science-minded. Now, speaking of terminology, there's a term that I read up on when I was doing a little bit of research so that I could know enough to at least ask you some good questions today. And that word is eruption. IRRUPTIONS, not E.
Right.
Doesn't
Not an
start with
eruption, an eruption.
Eruption, exactly. And one of the things I read up on was owl eruptions and how that term is very commonly associated with snowy owls. So first off, could you kind of define what that word is, what that term is within birding, and talk a little bit about how it relates so strongly to snowy owls?
Yeah, it basically refers to a large migratory influx of birds that's not their regular pattern. And so some years, conditions or other factors drive large numbers of snowy owls to come down into the United States. And in those eruption years is when we see and can find lots of snowy owls. On an average year, that doesn't happen. It's just a regular year. Sort of the way oak trees have mast years and some other populations of birds and other animals can have a population explosion. Mm-hmm. There can be a population component to that as well.
Okay. All right. Thanks for going over that. All right. So moving on to the big topic of the vodcast. So Dustin had mentioned to me the past couple of weeks a few times wanting to tackle this topic as part of our new vodcast for Hike and Hearth, and specifically talking about the ethical considerations that people should be taking when it comes to bird watching, specifically of species like owls. And I'll be honest with you guys, like, I wasn't entirely sure we were going to be able to make an entire episode off of this one topic. So I had gone online to do some research to educate myself. And I was actually really surprised with the number of articles and headlines that there are out there by a variety of different birding organizations and wildlife conservation groups talking about the ethical concerns and some of the problems that come with people who are huge fans of owls and want to go out and bird watch them. So Dustin, when you brought this topic to me and we started talking about it, one of the things that I actually started to think is, are you personally like avoiding actively birding for owls? Because he has photography of owls, but when I started thinking about it, when you come home from those bird watching trips and you show me those photography of owls, which is kind of special, you've never offered to like bring me back to those locations so that I could see the owl.
I didn't know you wanted to, for one. So, we can make that happen for you. Is there a target bird you have?
I totally want to see an eastern screech owl. But back to the ethical considerations, like, are you okay with that? Are you okay with broadcasting when you see owls? Or do you actively go out specifically looking for owls?
Yeah, so I want to set this up by saying there's different styles of birding that are out there.
Okay.
Some people love to go out without a plan and bird by finding every species that they can and get surprised by whatever they find.
Okay.
And are happy to see a bird they've seen many times before, but maybe didn't expect on the trail that they went to, that they hadn't seen it there before. I lean in that direction. That's the style of birding that I like.
Okay.
Some people really, and we could do a whole podcast on styles of birding. I think that would actually be really good. Some people like to check all the socials and the rare bird alerts and see what's been reported where and go find that thing, because it's a little bit like a scavenger hunt, mm-hmm. or a little bit like geocaching, where you kind of, this thing is in this place and can you go find it and can you check it off the list and move on to the next thing? That tickles for a lot of people. It's not my favorite style of birding. I'll do it. I'll chase a rarity, now and then if there's something that I really want, or if there's something unusual, like when we went to see the Stellar's sea eagle a couple years ago. Another whole story about that. we'll talk about that in a podcast on eagles. But that style of birding is really popular with lots of people. And birders in general, I think sometimes unfairly have a reputation of being like obsessive about birding and being really driven and kind of fanatical about going to a place. I really don't like that at all. And I don't like to feed into that. So although I will occasionally go specifically looking for owls, more often than not, I'll go to a location and bird generally, but spend a little time looking for an owl or hoping to find an owl. And I this is a quirk about me, right? This next part is really just about me. I very, very much value finding something that I didn't expect to find and coming upon it organically. I don't love going to a place and seeing the crowd of birders that all have their scopes on a snowy owl or another bird and walking up to that group. It's okay, but that's just not my favorite. Like, there's not as much of a reward to me that way because I didn't find it.
Yeah.
And that's why we've gone looking for snowy owls and struck out. I do not have a snowy owl on my life list right now. Right? I know I could drive up to Salisbury, Massachusetts, where there are some known owls and some other places on the North Shore and even in the South Shore of Massachusetts, and find them on almost any given day. I'm kind of a romantic. I'd much rather happen upon one when I didn't expect it or when I'm out there alone. So that day will come, and it'll be really special to me when it does happen.
Yeah, I have to say, so we've gone up to the Plum Island area and the nature preserve up there a couple times in the winter months. And as Dustin said, we've never seen a snowy owl, even though that's been one of the birds we've looked for. Those have, without question, been my most enjoyable bird watching experiences with you, quite honestly. For starters, I am a fan of winter hiking. I love being out on the trail when there's very few other people on the trail and it's just you kind of immersed in the wilderness. And that's one of the things that I love the most when we've gone up to Plum Island. But yeah, I have not loved on the occasions you've taken me to see a rare bird when there's this mob of people. And no, I'm not trying to offend any of the birders out there, but there's been a couple of situations where I was like, this is not being out in nature. This is as bad as rush hour traffic in Boston. Like, this is not what I'm here for.
Yeah, it's the old few bad apples argument, right? That when there's something special to be seen, most birders that go for it are being very polite and following good birding ethics, which we're going to get into. But every once in a while, there's someone who kind of loses their shit because they're really excited about this thing that they've never seen, or they've spent considerable time and effort and money to get there to see this thing that they've romanticized, and it's right around the corner, and they really want to get there, and they lose control a little bit. And sometimes there's someone who's not really a regular birder, but they do want to see that thing that they've heard about. And they're trying to follow the rest of the crowd, but they just don't know. I don't want to call them ignorant, but there's an ignorance of ethics and birding and stuff like that, where if you're not in tune with it, it's really easy to get swept up in it. And having seen a few incidents like that, I would much rather try to steer away from them as much as possible and not contribute to them any more than is necessary, right? If there's a great bird, great. Get after it, see it, get out, but I'm not the kind of person that's going to spend an hour or two in a group while the group grows and grows. I'd rather leave and make more space for other people. And I'm not going to go back to it like the next day and the third day and that kind of stuff. I would much rather minimize my impact. Just like people want to be environmentally responsible with their travel, and everyone knows that airplanes make a carbon footprint. A lot of people try to at least minimize their carbon footprint by making one flight, doing multiple trips, or going for 2 weeks at a time, things like that, instead of doing like 3 separate trips to places. You know, the same concept applies to kind of get in, get out, make space for other birders, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So now that I've spoken my piece on bird watching enthusiasts run amok.
Yeah, and it's not the polite birders that make the news headlines either.
No.
It's when something goes awry or, some unknowing person maybe accidentally flushes an owl across a road where it could be dangerous. Those are the sorts of stories you hear about, and,
Yeah.
there are no headlines that really celebrate the ethical birders.
So let's get back to talking about the owls specifically. So there are some reasons why we have to be careful when we're bird watching around owls in particular. What are some of those things that people kind of need to keep in mind when it comes to going into the habitat of an owl? Like, why is that something that should be taken with all seriousness if you find yourself there?
Yeah, so I said earlier, like when we were talking about what makes owls unique, and partly it's their behavior, right? But spend a moment thinking about what's unique about their behavior. One is they're usually nocturnal, which means when we see them, we might be disturbing them during their sleep period.
Mm-hmm.
And an owl that doesn't have enough rest is going to have a harder time hunting, etc. So there's the potential to disturb them such that it impacts their ability to feed themselves the next day. We don't want that. Owls are also different than other birds in that, if you go out in the front yard, you see robins flitting about and you see bluebirds flitting about. They're moving a lot during the course of their day. So moving a little bit isn't much of a disturbance to them if you walk down the trail and they go up ahead of you or leave, the area. Owls are a little bit different. They're not moving all over the place. So each time that you happen to, like, you might come around a corner and startle an owl and you didn't mean to do anything wrong, but you have made it move when it wouldn't have otherwise moved. So you've created an energy usage for them that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And many birds live on this edge of balancing their energy and their food in order to be able to survive. So you want to obviously minimize that type of disturbance as much as possible. Snowy owls are a good example. They'll often sit on a dune sleeping for hours, and I almost said sleeping for owls, sleeping for hours and hours, but then as the sun starts to set, they get active and they're ready to hunt. But if there's a crowd of people back and forth on the trail, it might limit the size of their hunting grounds also. So that's another consideration.
Okay. What about, I know one of the things that you've talked about a couple times when we've had like great horned owls in the conservation land near our house, and I've said, oh, you should go on social media and you should let our friends know that, because we have a lot of friends who hike and birdwatch, and you've flat out said to me, I'm absolutely not going on social media and telling people where this bird is.
Yeah, so for any rare bird, it's sort of not cool to publicize specific locations about stuff. So even though I'm a big fan of putting all my records into eBird to capture my life list, I usually won't put a specific location. I might maybe name, if it's a common owl, like a barred owl, I might name the conservation land that it's on, but not the specific trail or the specific location. We don't want to encourage potential disturbance. So we want to, share very sparingly, not publicly. eBird has also made a lot of adjustments to not reveal sensitive species publicly in the eBird database until things have passed. So another tactic some birders use is, all right, we saw a snowy owl today. They might not put it into eBird until June when they're already gone, right? So there's that. It's just not cool to publicize where a bird like that is. Whereas if it was a rare bird that came over from Europe, like, I don't know, let's say there was a mandarin duck in Central Park, as there was a couple of years ago, there's no harm in a bunch of people walking through Central Park to see the mandarin duck. They're not impacting that duck at all. It's still just swimming around eating.
One of the things that I think is surprising that I recall seeing actually on social media, like maybe a year or two ago, was there was an individual that was posting some video clips that they had gotten of, I think it was a barred owl. And there were some really negative comments being posted where people were questioning how this person was getting this much footage of this owl hunting, and that it was really unusual and didn't seem very natural that this barred owl was repeatedly hunting in the presence of this human.
Right, and maybe at a really convenient angle, perhaps, for that photographer.
It was beautiful, beautiful shots. And it was like, you could tell by like how bright outside it was. It was also like in the afternoon.
People are very creative. And so if someone really wants a shot, people have figured out that you can coax an owl to fly where you want it to fly by feeding it with, say, a live mouse or even a frozen mouse.
Oh, gosh.
And it's a very bad practice, right? And I'm not saying that every photographer who gets a great shot does it, right? But people can kind of, if something just doesn't look right and they've got so many shots from obviously different multiple attempts at hunting, it would be unlikely for a photographer to sort of have gotten all of those shots in one session or even in 1 year, right? So it's really important to highlight that baiting of owls, and in fact, baiting of almost any animal, is really, not supported. It absolutely should be avoided at all costs. You definitely don't want owls to sort of become acclimated to people, to sort of associate cars parked on the side of the road with mice, because then they're flying near traffic. You don't want to make them reliant on people for a food source so that they get lazy about hunting, and maybe can't sustain themselves on the days that people are not there, that kind of thing. So baiting is a really bad practice. And, all ethical birders will call out anyone suspected of baiting. And you can do it politely too. You can say to a photographer, hey, those shots are really great. How did that happen, right? How did you set up that shot? And, if they know that they were doing something untoward, they might not be honest about it, but they know that they're being asked because they should be more responsible.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's really concerning. I was trying to figure out why there were so many questions I just remembered, like, I'm not a birder, but it was so unusual. Usually when people post wildlife photography or videos or whatever, there's so much enthusiasm from people who don't have the talent or the means to go out and get those shots themselves. But in this case, this person had posted like an entire gallery of images over multiple days of an owl hunting midday in this field. And like, there was just such a proliferation of questions about how this was happening in the comments that it caught my attention.
Yeah. I mean, getting great photographs is really hard. It takes effort. It takes time. It takes work. I understand the impulse to try to take a shortcut, but you never want to take a shortcut that could impact the health of a bird.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So it sounds like the things you shouldn't do are you shouldn't publicize the specific location of owls because you don't want to create too much traffic through its habitat because it stresses the bird out, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't bait the owls.
Never.
Have I left anything out aside?
I mean, there's some broader things, right? Like, to be an ethical birder, you want to do some of the simple stuff that should go without saying, but, make sure you're birding on property that you have access to.
Well, we're going to get to the shoulds in a second.
Okay.
Let's talk about the don'ts first. Is there any other don'ts?
Yes. Whenever you see a bird of any kind that, has its prey item and is eating,
yep,
you absolutely should not disturb that in any way, shape, or form.
Okay.
Right? If you happen to come around the corner and there's even a common bird like a red-tailed hawk with a squirrel, that should be like a stop and go back the other way. Don't force it off of its food.
Okay.
Also, the rule of thumb should be to never flush a bird like intentionally.
What does that mean?
It means make it fly away.
Okay.
Right? Make it move to another location. So if I'm out kayaking on the lake and there's a bunch of ducks, I'm not going to keep going closer and closer to them until they fly away. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm going to sort of stop paddling and maybe let my boat drift a little, right? But I'm not going to continually approach them until they fly away. If I happen to come around a bend and find a duck that I didn't know was there and it flies away, that was unintentional, like, that's okay. It's not ideal, but it's okay. but you want to make an active effort to never flush a bird away.
Okay. I know you have some photography of a baby owl. When you were in that moment, were there things that you thought of that you were like, I better not do this? What was there anything you were avoiding doing in your behaviors when you came across that baby owl out on a trail?
Yeah, owls are unique that way in that they will leave the nest long before they can fly. They have a long growth cycle from being born to being able to fly, whereas a bluebird can fly by its 14th, 15th day of living, and it leaves the nest and flies immediately, and it can fly to escape a predator. Owls don't have that. They are in the nest for like a month or 6 weeks and then start walking and leaving the nest, but they still can't fly, haven't grown their flight feathers and stuff like that. So there's 3 instances I can think of where, happening upon baby owls in the wild happen, and it's mostly a stop, don't get closer, take your photos, spend your time, but not excessive time, and leave, because they don't have the ability to leave on their own, and their parent certainly is around watching you and is a little stressed, because to them, you're going to appear like a predator, and they think that their baby is in danger, even though we know that they're not. It's still not okay to stress out the parent that way. So in one case, I was on a local conservation trail, and we were crossing. I had a whole group. I had done a group tour. There was about 15 of us, and we were crossing a bridge over the water and a little stream, and didn't expect it, but right up in front of us was 3 barred owlets that were really cool to come across, and they were doing the whole owl thing with like turning their head and focusing and looking different ways to learn how to triangulate and look at us. I don't recall that time that we saw the parent, but it was really great. It was nice as the guide that day, because we had been coming down the trail, and I said, this habitat is known to be home to some barred owls, but I haven't seen any in a while. And a minute later, these 3 baby owlets that I hadn't expected just showed up. So that was really great, and the whole group that's the other thing, is if something like that does happen, it's nice that there was sort of one singular limited disturbance, and a lot of people got a chance to see it for a couple minutes, and then we were off, rather than disturbing them over and over, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So that's why you don't tell people where owls are, because it creates a pattern and kind of the potential for repeated disturbance. You want to avoid that.
Did you encourage the group that day not to spread the message around as to where those babies were, and to just...
Yeah, everyone was responsible about it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So we've talked about the don'ts, right? We got the negative stuff out of the way. Let's talk about the do's. So you're out on the trail, you're having a wonderful day in nature, looking at all these amazing animals around you, and you come around the corner on the trail, and there is this glorious owl on a limb in front of you. What do you do as a birder? What are the good things to do? How do you navigate that situation well?
Yeah, I mean, fieldcraft is an active part of birding, and I've followed some birders, some really excellent birders, who kind of advise, pretend like you belong there, like you're foraging, right? Don't hesitate to go to the edge of the trail and pretend like you're nibbling on a leaf.
Oh, really?
Right? Don't hesitate to sit down and maybe pretend like you're eating some leaf litter or some pine needles or things. And it sounds crazy and like woo-woo, right? But for a bird that's not startled away, if you can be calm and settle down and own your space like you belong there, after a couple minutes, they will recognize that you're not a threat. So that kind of fieldcraft can be really important. And it's a good way for the bird to be comfortable with you and their presence. And that holds true for lots of birds, right? That's a technique a lot of people can use. That's one of the reasons why I like birding by kayak around the lake also, because it's hard to move fast in a kayak.
Yeah.
And I feel like birds generally aren't alarmed by the fact that you're slowly drifting towards them. And often they'll be right overhead, 8 or 10 feet, going about their business while you're floating there. So that's really good. But keeping your distance is really important. Using good fieldcraft is really important. This one's on the line of between a do and a don't. Using calls to attract birds is on the borderline of what's ethical, depending on the species and the location, the time of year. And there's not a perfect black and white answer for this. So in national parks, I think the strict rule is that there's no mechanical playback of bird calls allowed at any time. I think verbal calling is allowed with discretion. I may want to check on that. But so, for example, if you're like in the middle of summer and you want to see if there's some birds you saw moving down in the thicket and you want to get them out, there's a technique called pishing where you kind of make a psh, 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 psh sound. And some birders have strong feelings and will refuse to pish or don't like birders that are pishing. Mm-hmm. We don't want to pish them off, right? But in a limited basis to get the bird to just come up and show itself, you're not really causing any harm. If it's an active bird going about its business, yeah, you take it away for a second, that kind of thing. But if it's January right now when owls are defining their territory and they're looking for mates, it's stressful for a great horned owl to hear its call or the call of what it sees as a competitor for its mate on its territory. So calling might make the bird come in and expend energy that it wouldn't have otherwise expended.
Does eBird have a disclaimer on how you should and should not use the bird calls on its app? Do you know?
Good question. They probably do have some guidance and following, I'd recommend everyone do check out the ABA, the American Birding Association Code of Ethics. I forget what it says specifically about calls, but it's really important to not use calls, especially not mechanical calls, anytime a bird is in its mating and breeding season, and to never use them excessively. There's a few birds that are very receptive to hearing its call, and you could play it one time like an oven bird, and it will often come right in and you're not doing any harm because it's a very active bird in the forest and they're always talking to each other and calling back and forth. Those sorts of things. So even in situations where using calls is okay, use it sparingly.
So I will say, as a non-birder, you guys can take my opinion or leave it. If for any birders or nature enthusiasts listening to this, I don't like it at all. I think it's mean. I just think it's mean. You're either stressing out a bird who thinks that competition has come into its habitat, or you're giving it false hopes that,
That's true, yeah.
Maybe this is going to be a love connection. And I just think it's mean either way. Like, you're lying to that animal about its situation, that you're flat out lying to it. And I don't think that's, I prefer an honest relationship with the wildlife that I'm interacting with. I also very much feel that the forest is not my home. I am an observer when I am there. And I am a guest of these animals.
I rarely use any mechanical calls to call stuff in, and I will pish outside of season just to, like when we're doing the Christmas bird count, because it's really important to identify the species, and it's not in they're not in territorial mode, that kind of thing. So I'll do those things very sparingly.
Okay. So you mentioned the American Birding Association and this code of ethics. So I had never heard of the American Birding Association until I started getting our notes together for the vodcast, and you told me to make sure that we can put that code of birding ethics up on the screen when we do our edits to the video for this. What is this American Birding Association like, and what is the deal with the code of ethics? Can you just go over that real quick?
Sure. So it's an organization that kind of gets birders together and manages the logistics of high-level birding. What I mean by that is they're the ones responsible for defining the territory that is considered the I'm forgetting the phrase for it, the ABA area of, if you see I want to think of a rare bird that's not normally in the ABA area. Let's say you see a European robin from England, and it happens to show up. That's a bad example because they don't vagrant over here. There's a bird called the northern wheat ear in Europe. And every once in a while, some of them come over into North America, and they're on the New England coast or something like that. If a northern wheat ear shows up in the ABA area, when you record it, it counts on your list for that place. if you go across to Europe and see a northern wheat ear, accounts for that place, but it's not a rarity, right? So they define the territories, and when there's like elite birders that are really going after a big year, like you may have seen in the movie, that northern wheat ear might count for their big year list in the ABA area, if they saw it in Massachusetts, but they can't just go to Europe and find it and count it because that's outside of the area.
Got it.
Now, they might be doing a big year globally, which is a whole different thing, right? But they define the territories. They also are involved in the sort of the confirmation about a rare bird when it shows up and keeping the record keeping for different areas. So like if that same northern wheat ear shows up in Massachusetts, it's rare. Some birders will get it, but that happens like every couple of years. Like it's not crazy for a northern wheat ear to show up in Massachusetts. But I bet if that same bird kept flying and showed up in Kansas, it would be much rarer. So they're responsible, along with like the ornithologists' organizations, for vetting that it was actually a northern wheat ear that was seen in that place, and for keeping the records, because it might be a first record for Kansas is a big deal, but it might be a 100th record for Massachusetts this century, that kind of stuff. So they do some of the drier record keeping side of stuff, and they do a lot of fundraising and publicity, and are a force in birding conservation. For example, did you know there's a bird of the year every year that the ABA puts out?
I did not know that.
They didn't. The bird of the year for 2025 is the common loon, which was just announced last week.
Oh, that's cool.
Last week being the first.
It makes me think of John Oliver and his campaign in Australia. What were they trying to come up with? The bird of the century? Is that what that was all about?
It's the Puteki Teki.
Yes. I loved that. I loved that whole campaign that he did. It was great. Yeah, you find nature enthusiasts in the most unlikely of places sometimes.
And the ABA is a great way to get connected to better birders in your area and the elite birders in the country. And they're always represented at the birding festivals and things that happen around the country. So, yeah, it's good. And our connection locally to the ABA is the current president of the ABA is a gentleman named Wayne Klockner. And Wayne lived in the town next door to us for a number of years. And I had gone birding with him on some of our local trails. And then I was pleasantly surprised a couple years ago, there was some turnover. The prior president of the ABA, Jeff Gordon, left his term as president ended. And when they recruited a new president, it was my birding acquaintance, Wayne Klockner. So he's their current ABA president. Hey, Wayne, if you're watching.
All right. So I have one question for you, and then I think I'm, for the most part, done. You mentioned a big year. And although that isn't a topic that we had, terminology, again, for anyone in the audience who's not familiar with that term, I know it's a big one in the birding community. So what is a big year?
Yeah, birders are listers at heart, right? Some people really like just keeping their life list to know that I've seen however many species and keep track of that number all the time for their life. Whatever bird they see, wherever, it goes onto their list, and they're always trying to grow that. Some birders like to just track how many birds they saw that year, so it keeps them motivated to see birds that they've seen before. Some birders really want to grow the list in their territory, whether it's on their yard list or their patch of conservation land they visit frequently, or in the state or the county or the region that they live in. So you can have a big year of many different flavors, but the most competitive style of big year is when elite birders really plan a whole year around traveling all over North America in order to find as many of the birds that they can. And I forget what the record is now, but it's in the low 700s is a possible number. If you plan the travel in your year correctly, you can get, say, 740-ish species in a given year. And the current record holder is a woman named Tiffany Kirsten, who said it a couple years ago.
Good job, Tiffany. I remember we saw a movie with Steve Martin and Jack Black that was on this particular topic. So if you would like to watch a comedy about this, that would be my recommendation. All right. So on this note, Obviously, owls are amazing, especially eastern screech owls, my favorite. I have nothing else to add. I think that we've learned an awful lot today about the ethics of bird watching in general and what the do's and don'ts should be and the things to keep in mind when you're interacting with wildlife. Dustin, do you have anything else that you want to share?
Nothing else. I just hope people learn something a little today and are motivated to go out and ethically find one of those owls that they have wanted to see for a long time and maybe have some skills to do it now. Oh, by the way, we didn't really talk about like tips for finding owls, like out in
That's a good point.
out in the woods, right? The most important thing is to listen. Of course, if you hear an owl calling, at this time of year, it gets dark at like 4:30 where we are. They'll often be calling, 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours before sunset, especially on a cloudy day, because the darkness feels like it sets in a little bit earlier. So obviously listening is important, but also look for the signs of owls, right? At the base of trees with good owl perches, potential owl perches. Look in the leaf litter for owl pellets that they leave behind, and look on the trees for the remnants of the white poop that they dropped from up above. It might leave a streak on the tree, and it's called whitewash. So look for those signs of owls, and even if those signs don't lead you to the owl in the moment, they will confirm the recent presence of owls, so that you can keep going back responsibly to that habitat where they might be. Or you could sit down, right, with your back against a tree and spend 30 minutes or an hour just sitting there observing what's going on. And that is a good way to, catch an owl when it does decide to move naturally.
And speaking of looking, you can also look for us on YouTube as Hike and Hearth TV. You can find us on Blue Sky and as Hike and Hearth. You can find our website, which is hikeandhearth.com. And we are also talking about releasing our vodcast as a podcast on Spotify. So you might have found us that way as well. Make sure you check us out on our website. There's not only our blog, but Dustin's photography is also featured there. And make sure you are subscribing wherever you find us so that you're always up to date on what our next episode is going to be on. So that's my spiel. Any last words that you have for us, Dustin?
Just a reminder to keep your eyes on the skies and your hearts in the wild. See you next time, friends.
Bye, everyone.